Hi, my name is Adrian Reed and my presentation today is entitled Systems Thinking, Practical BA Techniques for Business Agility. Now, one thing that I think we all have in common, one thing that unites us as business analysts or as change practitioners, is whatever industry, whatever organisation we happen to work for, our organisations seem to be increasingly needing to respond to external change that seems to be hitting them at a phenomenal pace. Now, of course, if I was giving this presentation a year ago, I would be talking about technological change or new disruptive business models. And those things are still very, very relevant, of course. But we're also living through the middle of a global pandemic. And it's probably fair to say that some of our organisations reacted and responded to that better and quicker than others. Some had that ability to see what was coming, to put plans in place and to react. So I'm going to be talking about that idea of business agility, of organisations seeing something or sensing something, making a decision and then acting on it. Now, please do ask questions as we go along. You can type your questions in the chat box and I'll answer as many as I can as we go along. I should point out at this juncture that I'm not going to be specifically discussing Agile as a set of practices or approaches. So as important as they are or can be, I'm not going to be talking about Scrum or Kanban or any of those approaches. We're looking more broadly at the broader idea of business agility. Now, that in itself is a really huge topic. So the particular lens we're going to look at it through is the lens of systems thinking. Now, systems thinking itself is a huge set of topics, set of disciplines. So the particular lens we're going to look at systems thinking through is business analysis. And the question I'm going to attempt to answer with this presentation is, what tools and techniques from the world of systems thinking could we as BAs take to help our organisations achieve even more business agility? And my presentation today is in two main parts. I'm going to start in just a second by talking about why. And in that section, there'll be a bit of a historical case study, a bit of a story that I want to tell you. And I warn you in advance, it's going to seem like a bit of a curveball story, so do strap yourself in for that, but it really is relevant, I promise. Then we're going to move on and talk about how. And I want to share with you some tools, some techniques, some ideas from the world of systems thinking and other places that we can potentially use as BAs, bring into our toolkit to help our organisations nudge towards that, that business agility. Now, I'll only be able to cover each technique relatively quickly, so there is, if you download the slides, there's a references and further reading list at the very, very end. Or indeed, if there are particular techniques that when you see them you want to know more, if you type that in the chat, then I can respond to you in the chat as we go along as well. So first of all, why? Why is this stuff important? Well, as I say, this is the point where I want to tell you a bit of a story. I want to go a little bit off-piste, a little bit curveball. And I want to transport you back in time to March of 1980. And I'm going to kill the slides for this bit. It's probably true that some of us watching weren't born in March of 1980. Some of us probably were born but can't remember it. If you can remember March of 1980, you might remember that the Jam were #1 with Going Underground. Fantastic song. You might have been looking forward to seeing The Empire Strikes Back, which was going to be released in the cinema in a few months' time. You might also have been quite worried about the escalations between the USSR, the UK, the USA and other nations. Because it's easy to forget, but in March of 1980 we were very much embroiled in the Cold War. And there were times when nuclear war was looking like a real possibility. Now, in responding to that threat, if you like, in exhibiting its own agility, the UK government, it turns out, for years before this, had been thinking about what would happen. What could civilians do, people like you and I, if the bomb were to drop or if the missile were to be launched? And in the years running up to the 1980s, the UK government commissioned a series of public information films. They were never designed to be aired. The only time they were designed to be aired is if nuclear war was imminent and unavoidable. But in March of 1980, these films got leaked and they were shown on a late night primetime TV news show. So I want you to imagine, it's March of 1980, you've got escalating concerns, escalations between different nations. You're flicking through the 3 channels that there are and this video comes on your TV.
Nuclear explosions are caused by weapons such as H-bombs or atom bombs. They are like ordinary explosions, only many times more powerful. They cause great heat and blast. They also make a cloud of deadly dust, which falls slowly to the ground. This is what is called fallout. So these are the 2 dangers. First, heat and blast, which is followed by fallout. You can protect yourself and your family. And later on, we will show you what steps to take.
Now, I don't know about you, but I find that whole video absolutely terrifying, right down to the iconography and the chilling music. And it makes me wonder, what were the government's plans if there was a nuclear war? And in fact, it has genuinely made me wonder that. I'm a bit of a geek. I collect historical information about this period of history. Here's some of the documents that I happen to have to hand. And if you're interested, what would have happened? The UK would have been divided up into different regions with regional headquarters. Presumably the central government would be worried about launching a counter-strike. Local councils would be responsible for coordinating whatever resources were left. And if you were a civilian like you or I, there would have been a manual dropped through your letterbox. This is a reproduction, but it would have been called Protect and Survive. And it would have handy advice on what to do if the 3-minute warning were to sound. And one of the key pieces of advice was to build a sort of inner sanctuary, a fallout room. And pretty much the advice was, hide under your stairs, or if you don't have stairs, take a few doors off of their hinges and pile some sandbags against them. Now, if you're looking at that with some suspicion, thinking, I'm not sure how effective that would be against thermonuclear war, you're probably thinking pretty sensibly. Even if there was any efficacy with that approach, like who's got sandbags lying around their house? I know I can't move for sandbags in my house, right? But the sandbags are going to get bought up and used, right? So it's really curious. The advice is really curious. Now, it turns out that there were other professionals really questioning the government advice at the time. And one of the professions that was really questioning the government advice was the British Medical Association. And they released this report, which is entitled The Medical Effects of Nuclear War. It makes very, very grim reading. I wouldn't necessarily recommend you go out and buy a copy of it. It, for example, raises questions about how sanitation would be handled, how fresh water would be distributed to the survivors, and how medical care would be given. Or essentially, it concludes that the NHS just couldn't quite cope in any kind of nuclear conflict. But there's a particular passage in here, hidden away in the middle, which really struck me when I read it. It says, it appears to the Working Party that most of the government's civil defence planning relates either to conventional warfare or to small, isolated nuclear explosions. Now think about that in the context of the 70s and 80s when this advice was being, created. What was the last experience, the last living experience of hostile enemy aggression by air? Well, it was World War II. And in World War II, you think of Dad's Army, you think of Anderson shelters, you think of people hiding under their stairs or in their garden or in the tube or wherever. And that makes total sense. But in a situation where you've got multiple intercontinental ballistic missiles heading towards every major city in the UK, that advice ceases to make sense. But it's almost like someone had taken best practice from one area, dusted it off, and tried to make it relevant for a completely different context. Because ultimately the context had changed significantly, but the advice, the response, hadn't. You can almost imagine someone, can't you, in Whitehall, going and looking at the lessons learned log or going and looking at the best practice and basing the new advice on that historic advice. Of course, in reality, it wouldn't have been useful in the way that it was being portrayed. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Adrian, we don't live in the 1980s UK, although probably the fashion's going to come back soon if it isn't already. And we certainly don't work on nuclear armoury, and neither do I, right? But I bet you've seen a situation where somebody takes a set of practices that worked really well over here and they transplant them without any thinking about the context to somewhere completely different, and then they're surprised when it doesn't work. Like, you think about it, right? What on earth would make us think that a set of practices that were developed over decades and decades ago in a motor manufacturing plant in Japan could be taken without any alteration and implemented in a call centre in the UK? Right? Like, why would we think that would work? And I'm not having a go at Lean or the Toyota production system. I think that, it really can work well when it's suitable for the context and when it's adapted to the context. And I think this is a key point for business agility, is we have to be so aware of context. And taking yesterday's past practice from a different environment just ain't going to cut it. So context is key, and making sure that we keep that in mind is so very important. So you might be wondering what I mean by business agility. So one way of looking at it, I tend to think in pictures. And you can imagine there's a flux of ideas, events, of stuff happening out there in the external world. You've got opportunities, you've got threats, you've got world events, you've got, pandemics, all of these sorts of things happening. And organisations can appreciate some of those. They can see some of those. No organisation can see everything. You can only see where you're looking. You can't, as a human being, see what's behind you, for example. You choose what you can see. And the same is true of an organisation. If you were working in Blockbuster in the 2000s, if Blockbuster wasn't looking at the internet, it wouldn't have seen a threat coming. I've no idea if it was or it wasn't, but if you're not looking for something, you tend not to find it, and you tend to be quite blinkered if someone tells you about it. So one way we can really help our organisations is to widen that appreciative setting, as it's sometimes known, help our organisations see more of that flux. And if you think about some of the external environmental analysis techniques that we use as BAs, they're perfect for that type of approach. We'll come on to talk about one of those a little bit later. If an organisation senses that change is necessary, well, it has to actually benchmark what it sees against its internal standards and values. So if an organisation sees something, it needs to work out, do I need to make a change? Is this in line with my strategy? Is it important? So this highlights that as BAs, we really ought to know about our organisation's strategy, mission, vision, all of those sorts of good things, so we can help not only see something, but know whether it's relevant. And then, of course, if it is relevant, a decision maker in an organisation needs to decide and some action needs to take place. And we can help by serving up that information, helping the decision maker have the information they need to make a decision. But crucially, often there's a lag between something being seen and the action being taken. If we can reduce that lag, if we can help our organisation see the change that's needed, help them find the experiment that they need to do to validate it and actually get that out there, then we get feedback, feedback from that flux of ideas and events as well. So you might well be wondering what we mean by system. And it's sort of interesting because probably in most organisations, when you hear the word system, people are talking about IT systems. And I don't just mean that. By systems thinking here, I'm talking about thinking in systems. So that's not just the IT, it's the people, the process, the policies, all of those sorts of things. And the best definition I've personally come across, or one that I come back to time and time again, is from the Open University Systems Department. And that defines a system as an integrated whole, distinguished by its particular purpose for a particular observer. The whole's essential properties arise from the relationships between its parts. So the whole's essential properties arise from the relationships between its parts. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because quite often in organisations we focus a lot on the components, on the things, but less about the connections. So we need to think about that stepping back, thinking holistically, which we do as BAs anyway, is very, very close. It's not the same as systems thinking, but there's a sort of family resemblance. So how are systems thinking and business agility related, and why should we care? I've chosen just a couple of extracts here from some authors, some thought leaders that you may well be familiar with. In their fantastic book, Business Analysis Agility, James and Suzanne Robertson commented that analysis and systems thinking are one of the prime ingredients for achieving the right outcome. In the book about business analysis and Agile, Debbie Paul and Lynn Gervin commented that systems thinking helps analysts to enable organisational agility. IIBA, in their business analysis body of knowledge BABOK guide, shows systems thinking as like a core underlying competency. It's almost like all roads are leading towards these ideas converging. So we really ought to, as practitioners, explore them and see what there is for us in that intersection. So with that in mind, I want to move on now and talk about how. Some tools, some techniques we can use to avoid those situations where we end up prescribing best practices from one area that don't work in another, that enable us to really embrace the changes that are happening in our external business environments. And I have sort of four main areas that I want to talk about here. I'll be starting by talking about assessing the context, because we talked already about how important context is, so we don't just end up transplanting things from one area to another. I'll then move on and talk about understanding perspectives and boundaries, because often where the boundary of the system, in inverted commas, is important. We might have different perspectives on where a system starts and ends. I'll then talk about understanding the problem situation. That's an area you'll probably be familiar with as a BA, but we've got some techniques in there to share. And finally, very, very, very briefly at the end, I want to talk a little bit about proposing and taking action. But we'll start off by talking about assessing context. Now, there are many tools, techniques, approaches we could use to assess context. One that I want to talk about briefly is the Stacey diagram. Now, this was originally proposed, created by Ralph Stacey, and it should be noted the version I'm using here is an amended version. There are various versions of this diagram if you Google it, and I'm going to put a bit of a business analysis spin on it. So what I'm presenting is by no means a sort of pure Stacey or complexity view on things. It's a bit of a business analysis practitioner view. And sort of broadly, the diagram looks like this. So you can see we've got a couple of axes here to concern ourselves with. So on the sort of bottom, we've got how close or far from certainty experts are on how we can solve a particular issue or problem or whatever. And on the y-axis, we've got how close to agreement people are on why we need to make some kind of intervention, or even sort of broadly what needs to change. So the way I think about this as a BA practitioner, and again this is a bit of an extrapolation, but the way I think of it is that the x-axis is what we would call how, right? Like the solution type axes or intervention. This axis is why and what. And there will be some situations where actually, you know what, if people genuinely agree on why and what something is necessary, there's a clear view on the benefits, genuinely there's a clear solution, where you're in the sort of domain of rational decision making, and if you're in the bottom left, you know what, you probably are in the just do it type of situation. The type of analysis and systems thinking techniques I'm going to talk about here aren't going to add a lot in that extreme left. As you get further up, you're probably in the sort of evidence-based policy making zone, particularly if you're in the public sector. But it gets more tricky when you're, say, up here, where you've got some sort of certainty on how things are going to be solved, but there's different agreements on why and what. And I suspect as an analyst you see that all the time. People have fallen in love with a solution, but no one knows why they want it. And there's lots of politics. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about with perspectives can really help there. Down here you've got judgmental decision making, and in the middle you've got complex decision making. A lot of what we're going to talk about is particularly valuable here in that middle section, not at the outer edges of complexity, but somewhere sort of in the middle. Now the reason I show this diagram is it can be really useful when you're starting a project, when you're parachuted in, to think about where that project, where that situation sits. Is it in the bottom left hand corner? Can you just do it? Or does it require a bit more holistic, systemic thinking? So I find it a really useful conversation piece with stakeholders and a really useful sense-making tool for me to get a sense of what the situation is like. So we've talked about assessing context. So I want to move on now and talk about understanding perspectives and boundaries. And on the next slide, in just a second, I'm going to put a picture of something up. And what I want you to do is you can either shout out at your screen or you can type in the chat what it is and what it's for. And I promise you, it is not a trick question. So, this is the picture. And my question to you is, what is this and what is it for? Or more specifically, what is this and what is this for? And I'll give you a few seconds as you look at it and type in the chat or shout at your screen. And I'm pretty sure that many, most, or maybe even all of you are now typing away or shouting at your screen saying, it's obvious, Adrian, it's steps. Like they get you from one floor to another, right? And it's hard to argue with that. I mean, that is certainly what it is certainly steps, right? But if you look closer, and you may well have not noticed this unless you were particularly looking for it, if you zoom in, there's actually someone exercising, running up and down those steps. Now, I've no idea when those steps were built or who built them. They're very near Southsea Castle. They might have been built hundreds of years ago, for all I know. But I'm pretty sure whoever was building them wasn't thinking about designing them to enable exercise to take place. But that purpose has emerged, and people do it and people enjoy it, and actually they're an effective tool for that type of exercise. Now, I can't imagine going up to that person who is exercising and stopping them and saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry, these steps are designed to get you from one floor to another. You're running on them a bit fast, but you're not really supposed to use it for that." Like, I think I'd get a well-deserved slap in the face if I did that, right? I can't imagine like educating them on how to use the steps properly. But think about the processes, systems, whatever lens we want to look at it. How often have you heard in a meeting room someone say, "Oh, we just need to educate our customers on how to use our product or service or system or whatever"? Well, sometimes that is genuinely the case. It is genuinely we need to provide information and support. But another view is sometimes people use services, products, whatever, in ways we hadn't envisaged. And if we're going to embrace business agility, rather than saying, "No, you're using it wrong," maybe we need to adapt and say, well, maybe there's a customer segment here we didn't know about. And if we embrace that feedback, maybe we can make a better product, service, system for everyone. So for agility, as well as understanding context, building that feedback in, and rather than just having that temptation to push stuff out and educate people in the way of using it, it's actually getting feedback on how people use it, how they want to use it, is really, really important as well. So I'll give you a quick example of that. A while ago, about a year ago, I had to have a routine blood test. And as I suspect has happened to all of us, my GP, my doctor, gave me a form and also a telephone number to ring. So I needed to ring the St Mary's Phlebotomy Clinic. I didn't know what phlebotomy meant. I still don't really know, but presumably it's something to do with blood taking. So I rang them and they were very helpful. They booked me in, and it was really, a really good service, right? Because I could book an early appointment before work. When I went to St Mary's Hospital, which isn't the biggest hospital in Portsmouth, but it's big enough to be confusing for me, one of the things I noticed is that it doesn't appear to have been built expecting people to access it by foot. A lot of the signage appeared to be aimed at cars. And because I don't go there very often, luckily, I was quite confused. So if you look at some of the signage which I noticed on my way in, you'll see that you've got, for example, Portsmouth Dermatology Centre, Enablement Centre, you've got the Treatment Centre, you've got the Day Surgery, you've got this weird sign here, Brymore, pointing towards some traffic cones. I've no idea whether that's for me or where I'm supposed to go. So in the end, I went into, I think it was the day clinic, because I thought that might be where I needed to go. And there was a fantastic, really, really friendly receptionist. And I went in, I mentioned blood tests, and without skipping a beat, like it was the 30th time she'd said it that day, she said, blood tests. In the main building, over the car park, follow the yellow wall, or follow the orange wall, I think it was. And I'm like, follow the orange wall? That's sort of, that is a bit like follow the yellow brick road, isn't it? It's a bit like we're not in Kansas anymore, Tonto type of thing. So, somewhat confused, I went over the road, over the car park, and lo and behold, she was absolutely right. There was an orange wall, and the orange wall did lead to the blood testing area. But think about that in terms of agility, right? There's a person there who probably if she'd had like 30 people at 7:30 a.m. already ask her where the blood testing clinic was, how many hundreds or thousands over the year ask her, how much of her valuable time is being wasted? And why isn't someone listening to that feedback from either the patient or, more importantly, the internal staff member to say, hey, if we had better signage, people would get to their appointments. We might even have less missed appointments. There may well be very good reasons why that can't happen, and I'm certainly not having a go in any way at the NHS or the clinicians or the administrators. I think certainly at this point in history we're quite rightly as a nation more proud of them than ever. But maybe if that feedback could filter through, we could actually make their lives easier by removing some of those unnecessary blockers. So anyway, I went to the blood test. I met I presume, phlebotomist to take my blood, and she asked me a series of questions. And one of the questions she asked was, when did you last eat? And I said, about 45 minutes ago. At which point she said, oh, says here you were supposed to fast. And I said, oh, nobody told me that. She said, yeah, that happens a lot. Anyway, she took my blood anyway. Lo and behold, my doctor said you need to repeat the test. So I went back, had the repeat test, everything was fine. But again, with my business analysis hat on, I was thinking, she's saying this happens a lot. The feedback's there, but nobody's listening. Think about that appreciative setting, right? That appreciation. The organisation isn't hearing the feedback from its own staff. There's no mechanism, as far as I'm aware, of me easily giving that feedback. So agility is about understanding those customer experiences as well as our internal staff, who often know what's going wrong and well far better than some people give them credit for. So it's really important that we build those perspectives in as well. Now in reality, of course, it's about balancing perspectives. So one technique I want to show you which is great for that, which is a great technique, it's got a bit of a funky name, is critical systems heuristics. Now critical systems heuristics, or CSH, at their essence are a set of 12 core questions. Now there is far more to this than I could possibly hope to cover in this session, so there is a link in the appendix. Please do take a look at it. There's some really great stuff out there. But what I want us to consider using it for as BAs is as a toolbox, like a treasure trove of elicitation questions, particularly when you want to understand different people's perspectives. Now here I've laid it out in columns rather than the traditional 12 question view, but it gives you the sort of idea. And I won't go through all of these, I just want to go through the sort of top column here. Because you could imagine that sources of motivation, they're going to vary by different stakeholders, right? So I'm going to think as a patient that blood tests have a different purpose to perhaps the clinician. I might have a different view there. Now, if you do look in the appendix, there's a whole set of possible questions that you could ask. Again, these are sort of my interpretations of the classic CSH questions. So I won't go through all of those now, but do think about that as an elicitation question bank and see the appendix for those interpretations of the BA questions. But I just want to look at that top row. And let's imagine we're looking at the blood testing service within an organisation. And we're asking questions to different stakeholders about the purpose. Well, one particular stakeholder that we'd probably want to ask that question or these questions of is the phlebotomist or the blood taker, whatever they're called. And we might ask them, well, what do you think the blood taking service should do? Why does it exist? Well, it exists to take blood safely at low cost in line with clinical guidelines. Great, that's useful to know, hard to argue with. Who would you consider as the client or the beneficiary? Who does this serve? Well, maybe it's the lab and the GP. The GP requests it. Maybe there's some You know, I don't know who pays for it. Maybe there's someone paying for it as well. And how would we measure improvement? Well, maybe from the phlebotomist's perspective, it would be throughput, accuracy, cost. Maybe there's some clinical outcomes as well. Again, I'm not a phlebotomist. I am just guessing here. But a key point is that would very likely be different to if you asked me as a patient. Because what do I think the blood testing system should do? Well, I think it should allow me to conveniently get a blood test. Right? I may or may not care about efficiency. I want flexibility in when I can get my appointment. I consider myself to be the client. I'm very self-centered like that. And a measurement of improvement from my perspective, I may well agree with those, but I want availability of appointments as well. I don't want to have to wait weeks, and I want to be able to go in, you know, without taking a day off work. So a key point here is we can use those questions, and do look them up in the appendix. They're really quite, I find them quite handy, to elicit those different perspectives. And of course, in this example, neither of those perspectives is right. Neither is complete. But if we're going to have that agility to understand our stakeholders and develop something that they really want to engage with, then we need to know those stakeholders and reach some form of consensus, compromise, accommodation between them, so that the solution, system, process, whatever lens we look at it, will actually meet their needs. Another way we can build on this is with a technique known as a systems map. And a systems map is a really great intuitive technique, and it's relatively straightforward once you've got your head around it. And with a systems map, we might be interviewing the phlebotomist or another stakeholder, and we'll ask them what concepts are relevant for the particular system of interest that we're looking at. And concepts can be anything. They can be policies or IT systems or processes, doesn't really matter, and you just draw them as blobs. So here's an example. You can see here we've got a system which I've named a system to take blood from a patient. Okay, and we might say to the phlebotomist, well, from your perspective, what's inside this system? And they might say, well, me, of course, I'm the phlebotomist. And I need my blood taking equipment, and we've got to have a scheduling service. Oh, and there's some record keeping, and inside that record keeping system there's patient information, there's samples, and there would be other things, of course. And you just draw them as blobs. And it's not a physical view, this is a sort of conceptual view. It's whatever someone says is relevant, just initially copy it down. It gives you a view of their perspective. But one of the reasons this is really valuable is you can then zoom out and ask, well, hang on a minute, why in the first place are we taking blood from a patient? And you tend to find that that system, so in this case blood taking, exists in a much bigger system. So here, why do we take blood? Well, we take it to test the blood of a patient. Like, we don't just take it to store it. And in that system, we've got the general practitioner, another stakeholder who might have a perspective. We've got another scheduling service. Maybe there's an issue if that doesn't coordinate with the one at the level below. We've got the lab, we've got record keeping systems and procedures, and so on. But then we can zoom out even further and say, okay, but why do we test the blood of a patient in the first place? And then we find, well, actually, that's because we want to diagnose a patient's illness. Why do we diagnose a patient's illness? To treat a patient's illness. Why do we want to treat a patient's illness? Well, ultimately, we want to keep people well. Understanding these different layers is really important, because if you are in, say, the phlebotomy service of an ultimate system that wants to keep people well, you may well be doing preventative tests rather than just diagnostic tests. And if you think about 5 whys as a technique, we've kind of gone through a version of 5 whys there, right? But using it in a slightly different way. And what this shows is it's so very, very important for us as BAs to be aware of the wider vision, mission, objectives of our organisation. Because what we don't want to do is make a localised change in one area that actually makes it worse elsewhere. So agility is not just about knowing our stakeholders, our customers, their perspectives, avoiding those situations where we transplant things from one context to another without thinking. It's also about understanding those boundaries and what we're ultimately trying to achieve, so that we can create outcomes that really achieve that. So I want to talk a little bit, relatively quickly, about understanding the problem situation now. And if you are a business analyst, this is the section that's going to feel most at home to you, I suspect. This is the kind of bread and butter stuff. And one of the techniques I've already alluded to is external environment analysis. Because if you think back to that original diagram, appreciation was on there. Our organisations looking at the external environment. Well, that's the sort of technique that could have perhaps helped us avoid those situations where we end up prescribing advice that doesn't fit the context. We need to know what's actually happening out there in the world. And there are a whole number of techniques we could use. You're probably familiar with one or many of them. PESTLE is a fairly common one. Here you'll see an example of STEEPLE. Now, calling STEEPLE a technique is really too grand. Really, it's just an acronym. It stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, ethical. And these are categories that we can brainstorm through, or even better, seek data or insights, and start to imagine different possibilities. What might happen? How would we respond? How would our organisations respond? And it links back conceptually to a systems map, because the STEEPLE factors are things that are outside of that boundary. We can't necessarily directly change them. We might be able to influence them, and we certainly ought to be influenced by them, but they're things that are out there in the external world. Now, you might be thinking that STEEPLE and techniques like it are only really useful at a very strategic level. But the reality is, even if we're working on a small in inverted commas change within a small part of the organisation, we need to align to those external factors. Otherwise you end up making a change here that doesn't fit with the external environment, and that's almost like the opposite of agility. So agility is also about understanding those external factors and building them into the fibre of what we do. Having said that, we probably will be responding to a particular problem or set of problems. So I briefly want to talk about a multiple cause diagram. Again, if you've ever used 5 whys, you've probably found that you ladder down 5 whys and you find multiple causes. A multiple cause diagram is a great way of illustrating that. It's not going to work in the most complex situations where sometimes there is no easy demonstrable link between cause and effect, but in areas towards the middle and bottom of that Stacey matrix, it's going to have application. And I'll show you an abstract example, then a worked example. But here you can see what we have is we have some form of negative event or state that's happened, right? So that's like your problem, if you like. And we've tracked back the causes. So we've got A and B cause the event or the state, but E causes A, E causes B. So an arrow is showing causation, okay? Or it's where we think there's causation. We might not have proved it yet, but we think there's causation. Now I'll show you a worked example which will illuminate this further. This is my interpretation, and it's a shortened example of why patients might not be fasting prior to taking blood tests. Now I won't read out every part of this because you can of course download the slides and examine it, but I want to just show you that you have causal hubs, right? And causal hubs, you see these a lot in real multi-cause diagrams, and they're interesting because they sometimes help you redefine the problem. Because actually if the problem isn't just that the patient hasn't fasted, but it's that the doctor hasn't told the patient, that might help illuminate how you go about solving or resolving the problem. And you also get causal chains. So you can see here there's a chain around the IT that's used. So when I went for my blood test, they seem to be really struggling to get the system to print. Maybe that means they just forgot to mention that I need to fast. Now the reason all of this is relevant is that if you are using a multiple cause diagram, and in my experience stakeholders love them, like you can get people around a table and draw one of these, where you can scope it out. You can say, you know what, we know we can't address everything at once, but let's try an intervention on this piece. And if you're familiar with the agile delivery approaches, that can become an initial scope. You might then start creating a backlog off of the back of that. You know, you might start creating some epics for an initial backlog. So finally, and very, very briefly, I want to talk about proposing and taking action. And there's just a couple of things I want to talk about here. The first is the brown cow model. Now this comes from James and Suzanne Robertson's fantastic book, Managing the Requirements Process. And the idea here is that we can separate conceptually, like what we do from how we do it, and we can separate now from the future. And when we are thinking about change, well, we've typically got a how now, an as is, a physical way that we do something. We might get a physical signature. But what we ought to do is scrape away the technology and ask, what are we actually doing? And it might well be that if it's a physical signature, it's about authentication. Well, then we can say, what do we want to do in the future? Maybe we don't want authentication at all. We can redesign the work. Then we can start to talk about how that's achieved. But that above the line thinking is so very, very important. What organisations often do is go straight to the solution and end up baking in all of the nuances, all of the technical fossils, as the Robertsons describe them, that are in the situation today. So navigating around in this direction is far more beneficial. Once we've got that view, we can then start to think about backcasting. So actually projecting where we want to be and chunking it back. And this is where our sort of agile approaches work really well. We can start to deliver in an iterative, incremental or agile way. We might find that where we want to go changes as time progresses. And of course that's completely fine. We learn more as we go along. Agility is about that responding to new learning as we progress. So in summary, we've talked about assessing context. I gave you that crazy example of the UK government's responses to civil defence in the Cold War. We've observed how taking things without thinking from one context to another isn't necessarily going to end well. We've talked about understanding perspectives and boundaries with our critical systems heuristics, with our systems maps, understanding the problem situation with our steeple, our multi-cause diagram, and we've talked a little bit about proposing and taking action with our brown cow model and our backcasting. A final ponder point I want to leave you with. Now, I opened up with that crazy story about the Cold War. My question to you is, how many situations have you seen in your organisation where the types of approaches that we've talked about here weren't adopted, and perhaps where best practice from one domain was taken and transplanted without thinking about the context to another? But more importantly, what can we do as an enthusiastic, empowered group of global practitioners? What can we do to help avoid that so that our organisations, our stakeholders, achieve better outcomes for their projects, their services, and more importantly, for the communities in which they and we serve? And with that, I will say thank you very much for attending this session. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, I would absolutely love it if you would stay in touch. You'll see my contact details on the screen here. If you've liked what I've had to say today, you might want to take a look at my blog. There's hundreds of articles on there But either way, please do stay in touch, and do remember there's further reading in the appendix if you download the slides. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Hope to catch up with you very, very soon.